I was giving a talk, a kind of post-mortem after the 2016 election in Connecticut, I think. I was on a panel discussion with that, and I was talking about this very topic, abortion and the slaughter of disabled people via abortion. And after the talk, this gentleman in his 70s with a guy I later learned was his son in his 30s, clearly had Down syndrome, came up to me. And he just thanked me, the older gentleman, and said, nobody ever talks about this. As you pointed out, nobody ever talks about, thank you for bringing it up. I lost my wife, 2 years ago, and all I have in my life now is my son. He's the joy of my existence. And he's, it's so hard to hear the kinds of things we hear about abortion and how it's used against people like him. And in the middle of us talking, this guy who's probably in his 30s just grabbed me and hugged me as hard as I've ever been hugged in my entire life. Yeah, it makes
me emotional. Yes.
Because he feels it too. He can't really articulate it as well, but he feels the surrounding culture.
Well, I mean, I don't, anytime you're around someone with Down syndrome, or at least I'll speak for myself, anytime I've been around someone with Down syndrome, the spirit coming off that person is really unlike any other person you meet. I mean, that's just hard to imagine, thinking that it's good to get rid of people like that. I mean, there is just a kindness that it's impossible not to notice.
And there's data now to support this. People with Down syndrome actually rate their lives happier than those of us who don't have Down syndrome.
Of course.
Which is,
I'm not surprised at all, having spent time around people with that. I couldn't be less shocked by that.
And yet we have a regime of prenatal violence, which targets them in a way that's just reprehensible.
Well, but I'm also, in addition to feeling sorry for anyone who's targeted for genocide, I also worry about the attitudes that make that possible and that make it mostly unnoticed. And the core underlying attitude seems to be some people aren't worth anything. They're just objects that can be discarded. And I don't think that's a good attitude at all to have for our fellow human beings. Where did that come from?
Well, throughout human history, we've seen this be the norm rather than the exception, right? It was not great for disabled people at all before a Judeo-Christian ethic came on the scene in the West. And with this idea that every single human being, in virtue of their being a member of the species Homo sapiens, right, a fellow human animal in a way of speaking, has exactly the same value because that human being bears the image and likeness of God in precisely the same way, regardless of age, regardless of disability, regardless of burden, regardless of any accidental trait. In their very nature, in the very nature of who they are, the face of the image of God is present.
They have souls, we used to say.
Yeah,
People have souls.
They have souls. Before that, it was just a matter of course to consider human beings in this way. After that, though we didn't always live out, as Martin Luther King said, the true meaning of our creed. But we were on this trajectory, right? We were trying to better live out this principle of fundamental human equality, as the Declaration, says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all of us are created equal by God, right? Try to live that out more consistently. I think it's fair to say, and it's especially true in medicine, but I think it's true more broadly throughout the culture. As we've become post-Christian, as we've repaganized, at least again within our sort of spheres of power, not necessarily with the broader people, we've lost the ability to say that all human beings are equal. We've lost the basis for saying. Now we do affirm the view, like equality is maybe one of the most overused buzzwords around, right? But I think of it almost like cut flowers as an analogy. You can cut the flower off of its roots and put it in water and it'll stay beautiful for a little while, right? But everybody knows that once you cut the flower from its foundation, from its roots, it's dying. It's going to die. These ideas, these foundational ideas like fundamental human equality, have their roots in Judeo-Christian ethics. There's just absolutely no doubt about it. And we have cut these ideas away from their roots. And we still talk about them, right? That we still even use them as important ideas. But the issue is the idea is dying. The idea of fundamental human equality is dying. We're no longer on the trajectory of trying to live this idea out more consistently. we are now in a very different trajectory. Like people are losing their fundamental equality, right? We are thinking less about how to do this and more about, well, is it really being human that matters at the end of the day? Maybe it's about autonomy. Maybe it's about rationality. Maybe it's about self-awareness. Maybe it's about IQ. I've heard more and more people talking about IQ recently in ways that I find sort of disturbing, especially given what you said about Nazi Germany. And so once you move away from fundamental human equality, you're left with these trait X's, I call them. And it's very clear that human beings don't have those in equal capacity, right? Or some human beings don't appear to have them at all.
Right. I mean, I think it's really obvious that IQ determines more than any other factor your material success in life. I don't think there's any question about that. And I also think it has a huge effect on your interactions with the criminal justice system. I think it's a very important predictor of your life. I don't think it has anything to do with your value. So this is my opinion. In other words, I think IQ is super important. We should talk about it. Okay. But God doesn't care what your IQ is. It has nothing to do with whether or not you have a soul. You have a soul because you're a human being. Your soul is identical in value to mine. You may have an IQ twice mine. You may be 3 times as rich as me. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. But so just to be clear about my view on this.
Yeah. And if it's all right with you, I'd just like to name some of the categories of human beings that are on their way. As we've, if we think about the trajectory before of trying to live out this more consistently, we're now moving in a very different direction where people are falling out of the circle of protection for fundamental human equality. And so we've already talked about prenatal human beings and neonatal human beings as classic examples of that. In fact, it's so interesting to think about the early church's response to ancient Greece and Rome's infanticide was found in the Didache, which is a first century, essentially catechism, which gives us a really important insight into how they lived. And they contrast the way of life with the way of death and say Christians need to lead the way of life. And the way of life is explicitly focused on a couple of things. One, don't do abortion and infanticide, and they were talked about together explicitly because that's how the ancient pagan Greeks and Romans thought about them.
When was this written?
First century. I don't know exactly when in the first century, but first century. So it's very, very old. It's very, very old. It's called the Didache. You can find it online. You can find...
well, it's got to be one of the oldest Christian documents.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest Christian documents. It also, interestingly, contrasts the way of life with the way of death in a way that those who are the rich and unjust judges of the poor are part of the way of death, and the way of life is explicitly focused on one of the central messages of Christ, which is to see my face, he says, in the poor, right? See the image, my image in the poor. But okay, so this goes all the way back to the very earliest parts of the church, right? And now we're not just seeing this with regard to the populations that so perfectly mirror that, newborn children and prenatal human beings, but now we're seeing it with people with catastrophic brain injuries.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.